Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm so happy to welcome you to today's session of our series on dangerous ideas, censorship through a Jewish lens. I was away at the Rabbinical Assembly Convention last week, and I'm happy to see everyone's faces and display names again. And you can see that my webcam is, there's some kind of problem with it. So I'm going to see what I can do after this intro to restore the video. But in the meantime, I wanted to welcome you anyway, and at least you can see a picture of me. We're so happy to have Professor David Kraemer teaching us today. And this session is really about how the printing press kind of changed everything when it comes to censorship broadly and also in the Jewish community. I can't wait to have Professor Kraemer enlighten us about all of that. So this is, in some ways, censorship kind of hits its stride in this session today. I want to thank also our sponsors, our sponsors for today, Doctors Bonnie and Isaac Pollock, who are sponsoring in honor of the pursuit of knowledge, which is so beautiful. So thank you so much to Dr. Pollock and Dr. Pollock for your generosity today, sponsoring at the Chacham level. And we would love for other people to be inspired both by the learning and by the example of your fellow adult learners in helping us to make this series possible. We have 3 sponsorship levels. Chacham is $540, Sadiq is $1,000, and Navi is $1,800. We're so grateful to today's sponsors and all of our sponsors for making this possible and for setting an example. And there's more information on that in the chat. And now I will turn things over to Tani Schwartz-Herman for some additional announcements.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Just to go over the format of today's session, Professor Kraemer will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end of the session. You can use your chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Kraemer. For any technical or logistical questions, you can initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The PowerPoint presentation for today's class was in the email that you received with the Zoom link this morning. We'll be screen sharing that as well. Thank you so much to Dr. Kraemer for teaching once again as part of our Monday webinar series. Dr. David Kraemer is the Joseph J. and Dora Abbell Librarian at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he's also served as professor of Talmud and Rabbinics for many years. As librarian, Professor Kraemer is at the helm of the most extensive collection of Judaica, both rare and contemporary, in the Western Hemisphere. Professor Kraemer is a prolific author and commentator. His books include The Mind of the Talmud, Responses to Suffering in Classical Rabbinic Literature, The Meanings of Death in Rabbinic Judaism, Jewish Eating and Identity Throughout the Ages, and a History of the Talmud from its origins to the present day, among others. He is also the author and co-creator of the Haggadah app for iPads. Pleased to turn it over to Dr. Kraemer.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah, okay, great. It's good to see all of you. Pleasure to be with you. Of course, it's an exaggeration to say I can see all of you, but it's nice to know that you're all there. So we're going to discuss censorship in a very specific way today, and that is in connection to the invention of movable type print in the 15th century and the revolution that brought about, particularly in the 16th century, and in very specific contexts. So let me say a word of broad introduction before jumping into the specifics. The broad introduction, and this is really outside of the topic as such, but it's my saying, and I encourage us all to think of anything we study this way, that we're far better off examining Jewish experience and phenomena in the broader context of human experience and phenomena at the time of the Jewish experience we want to understand. It is fair to say that it's impossible to understand the censorship of Jewish works without understanding the censorship of other works at the same time. It's impossible to understand the impact that print, meaning movable type print, had on Jewish culture and Jewish learning without considering how that same invention, that same new technology had an impact on general culture. And we'll consider some parallels as we go ahead. Another very interesting aspect of what we're going to examine today is the fact that we ourselves are living through, although it's matured somewhat, we're still living through, though, an information revolution. The way we access information is very different than at least what was possible in the past. The mere fact that I am here with you and you are here with me in some weird electronic sense is evidence of that fact. To bring together this number of people from the many places where you find yourselves in order to both hear me present and to have the opportunity to ask questions and so forth. Obviously, this would have been unheard of not long ago. And the fact that we can do this changes the way we relate to one another, the way we understand, the way we gain information, the way we understand information, and so forth. The fact that we can go online and answer our questions, however dubious some of those answers might be, so quickly has affected us. The truth is that the multiplicity, great multiplicity of sources of information that are available to us, whether it be through hundreds of cable channels or streaming services or the like, the fact that unlike in the not too distant past, most of us got our information from one of three sources. Those three sources in the United States were called ABC, NBC, and CBS. Or if we were reading print, it was whatever your local major newspaper was. But there weren't a lot of sources of information. Today, even if we restrict ourselves to broadcast news, there's so many sources that it affects the way we think about what's true and what's not, what's happening, what's not happening. It affects our politics and the like. And as you'll see, there's a profound parallel to all of that in what we will be considering. So the broad rule is take a broad view, and you will learn a lot more than you might have if you restricted yourself to the particular experiences of a particular people, in this case, the Jews. I'm going to begin with consideration of what came before. The only way to understand how censorship responded to the invention of movable type print is actually to go to the world before movable type print was invented, and that is the age of the manuscript. So we here at the JTS Library have got a lot of manuscripts. We've got, in fact, the largest collection. Why is it? There we go. Wait, let me go back to the first slide here again. Go here, hit from the beginning. There we are. So, you know, we've got an exceptional collection, and I could have taken one of many, many things, but I thought that it would be most interesting to start with prayer and to go back to a Siddur that we've got from the Cairo Geniza. Many of you, I'm sure, know the Cairo Geniza is this vast collection of discarded works found in a synagogue in Cairo that accumulated over the course of nearly 1,000 years. The Geniza is unlike other Genizot in a couple of outstanding ways. One of them is the fact that this Geniza, unlike most Genizot, was never sent for burial. Our Genizot, we collect sacred writings that can no longer be used. We put them for temporary storage in a geniza and then send them for burial. This geniza was never sent for burial. And so we've got materials in this geniza that go back literally to the beginning of its accumulation, which was in the 10th century. What you've got in front of you, you can see for those of you who read Hebrew, and this is overall quite clear. I'm sorry for the funny light on this, but we protect our geniza materials by putting them in mylar, and mylar, of course, reflects. So that is the ceiling light you see on the page reflected from above as I took this picture. This is a prayer book, and it was probably written, I mean, we can't date it precisely because there's nothing on it that gives us, gives it away in that way. But most of the writing of this sort was from the 11th or 12th century. So 11th, 12th century Siddur that was used by somebody, we have no idea who, in the community, the Jewish community of what we later called Old Cairo, which is the city of Fustat, which was there before Cairo was founded. In any case, this is from the weekday Amidah, and it is a very, very good example of the world of manuscripts. Just to focus on the technology first, manuscript, as the name says quite literally, is those things that were written by hand because there was no alternative. And the fact that things were written by hand means that there were very few of them, because to write required the knowledge of using writing materials that themselves required some technical language, some technical information. So, a scribe would have to write most things. Some very well-educated common people, non-professional scribes, might write as well, particularly keep short records for business. But something like you see in front of you is a scribe, or someone who's at least trained at the level of a scribe. But because it needed to be written by hand, meaning one copy at a time, that means that works, including prayer books, were very, very rare. Manuscripts were few. And if they were few, it means, and these are the laws of economics, it's all about supply and demand. So if the supply was very small, and there was demand for these works, for prayer books, that means that they and other things like them would have been very expensive. So how many people in a synagogue would have had a prayer book? The answer is a few, but not more than that. And that's true of any synagogue in any but the most wealthy of Jewish communities during the manuscript age. What does that mean in terms of the phenomenon of what's written? So you have in front of you the weekday Amidah, the weekday silent prayer. Some of you will know this from your own experience praying during the week. Hopefully you'll be a little bit familiar with it. So if you look at the page on the left near the bottom, the beginning of the, fourth or fifth line from the bottom, you've got the words Goel Yisrael, which is the end of one bracha. My interest is in showing you the one that comes immediately after that. It's the one that begins in the middle of the line, Rifa'enu. So it's the prayer for healing, and it's a very nice prayer. It says, heal us, oh God, that we be healed. And, it's brief, it's to the point. And it focuses, I think, quite clearly in our version of it on physical illness and physical healing. But look at what you've got here. Rafa'enu Hashem Elokeinu. This is scribal writing of the divine name and Eloheinu, our God. So heal us, right, Lord our God, mimachov libenu yagon va'anacha. So heal us from the pain of our hearts, and anguish, and another word for anguish, right? But then it goes on into physical things, v'dever and plague, v'aver mimenu, v'dever haver mimenu, and remove plague from us. I couldn't agree more. Baruch atah Hashem, rofei cholei amo Yisrael, and the ending is the same. But the body of this is very, very different. than versions we're accustomed to, and it doesn't matter whether you're Ashkenazi or Sephardi. It doesn't matter, what kind of prayer book you use. Anything that you use will be very different from this. And this is notable for its focus on heartache, on emotional illness, as it were, or emotional pain and being healed therefrom, as opposed to physical. We have no idea who prayed this, and we have no idea whether they were isolated or in the company of others, how often this version was repeated. But one of the things we know from the world of manuscripts is that texts change quickly, and they changed a lot, and they could be individualized. And that had its consequences. Your prayer might not be the same as mine, even if we agree on what the beginning and the end of the prayer is. To take another example, this is the next page. And here, we've got subsequent blessings from the Amidah, from the silent prayer, the daily silent prayer, about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the bottom. We've got a prayer that we have a very, very different version of. It is for the removal, for the elimination of, I don't know, enemies of God, enemies of Israel. It's hard to, since it's been changed so much, it's hard even to know how to label this particular prayer. But look at the version here. L'mishumadim al tihi tikva im lo yashuvu. To those who have, by the Jewish community, been ostracized, let them have no hope until they return, until they do tshuva. Im lo yashuvu l'toratecha. Unless they return to your Torah, let them not have any hope. But then look at what follows. Hanotzrim v'haminim karega yovedu. So Christians and sectarians, let them be wiped out in an instant. Now, needless to say, a prayer like this would not find many fans in the Christian community, but it could easily be written and passed down here in a Muslim context because very few people would actually see it. So during the manuscript age, with few books being read by few people, and this was true not only in Christian and Muslim communities, but in the Jewish community as well, it meant that, first of all, things could be adapted and changed. For example, we've got another manuscript in our collection, which I don't have an image of here, where a young woman living in northern Italy in 1471 recited in the morning blessings, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, for making me a woman and not a man." Right? I mean, something unheard of elsewhere. But in a manuscript, again, since every manuscript is individual, nobody would have seen this aside from the owner, let alone objected to it. And so that is what came before. Let me spend half a second now just to take a question or two, if anybody has a question about this observation of the beforehand, the manuscripts. So Tani, if there's anything in the chat, or I don't know if it's you, Julia, and then I'll go on. But I just want to make sure, there are no questions I'm not bearing in mind.
We don't have much so far. One person asked just a general question about other printing techniques that were around at the time, woodblock printing, lithography. Was there a reason that those wouldn't have been used? I guess the implication is that you could mass produce a little bit more with those.
Yeah, but no, they're painstaking technologies. They didn't, both the material that was used and the way it was set did not allow for quick change. If you think about a several 100-page book, right? If you're dealing with movable type print, you can set a plate and print it and then reuse the type and reuse it again and again. Allows for very quick production, relatively speaking. None of those other technologies makes the same possible. Okay. Anything else, or can I go? Should I go on?
Sorry.
This, of course, is our pre-topic, but it's important to understand how the change affected everything.
So yeah, I'll just broaden this question a little bit. If you can say a little bit more about, or unless you kind of want to move on from the Siddur, but if you can say a little bit more about how a Siddur would have functioned in the community given
the absence of Siddurim.
Right, exactly.
Okay, yes. No, that's a very good question. And the answer is that for most people, a prayer experience, for example, would have been by, of necessity, overwhelmingly oral. Certain parts of the service, therefore, through familiarity and conscious memorization, would have been held by memory, and therefore you could recite the Shema, for example, by heart, including not only the first line but the other paragraphs, if you have some experience with it, or the blessings before and after, the blessings of the Amidah. But there are long other sections that you might not have known by heart, or depending upon who you were, you might not even have known the essentials by heart. And so you would have had to rely on the Chazan, on the Shalech Tzibur, who often would have been the only one in the congregation to have a book. Imagine how difficult it would have been on the holidays, for example, when so much is unique to those days. Nobody would have known those prayers, and very few people would have had a machzor. So you would have been overwhelmingly reliant on the cantor in the middle of the congregation reciting these things, and you would have had to listen and recite amen where appropriate. But that would have been your experience. Print changed everything, and I'm going to use that to go on to begin to get to what the topic is. So what you see in front of you is, and I want to see the whole screen myself, so I have to do that, so I can see what I'm pointing out. You could see this is the first printing of the complete Talmud. There was an earlier printing of the Talmud by Soncino Press in Italy in 1483, but it wasn't complete. This is the first complete printing, Bamberg, 1520 to 23. And this should look to you like an absolutely conventional page of Talmud if you're familiar with this. One of the things we don't appreciate when we look at this, though, is that what we see is made possible by print. You will often hear teachers who say things like, this represents the traditional Jewish way to study, because you've got the central text and then you've got the commentaries. And not only do you have the commentaries, but you've got Rashi on the inside margin and you've got Tosfot on the outside margin. So you've got Mishnah with its Talmudic commentary and Talmud with its Rashi commentary, and Rashi who then has a counter commentary often from Tosfot, and commentator argues with commentator. And this we proudly refer to as the Jewish approach to study altogether. But then look at this. Right now, if I held that up for you and you weren't focusing and you didn't have a label at the top of the page, you would say to yourself, that looks like a Talmud, or that looks like a rabbinic Bible, what we call Mikrot Gedolot, with the central text in the middle, and the the commentaries around the side. But what you've got here is a Latin Bible with Christian commentary, and as you can see, it's from 1491, before Bamberg ever imagined, or even before Soncino imagined arranging the Talmud on the page the way we are accustomed to, or before Bamberg imagined arranging Mikrot Gedolot, the rabbinic Bible, on the page. There is nothing unique about this print to Jewish prints. And there is nothing characteristic about it that says Jewish as opposed to, in this case, Christian. What you've got here is printers who were both craftspeople and superb business people, who understood what this new technology which they were mastering made possible. And one of the things it made possible that never before existed was to create a new and improved product. Think about the way, to this day, new and improved is a way to advertise something. The new and improved product here was you can put the central canonical text literally in the center of the page, And you can put the commentary around it. And that way, someone who's trying to study Talmud, first of all, stands a better chance of affording what's in front of them, because even though books were still very expensive now, printed books were much less expensive than manuscripts were. But beyond that, if you wanted Rashi's commentary, you didn't need a second manuscript, right? That's the way it was during the manuscript age. You had a manuscript for the Talmud and you had a manuscript for Rashi, and you didn't need a third manuscript if you wanted Tosfot. All of this could be put on the page together. So everything we see here is not an expression of Jewish inclinations. It is an expression of what this new technology makes possible. And to be sure, it affected Jewish study and the way Jews think of study literally forever. It changed the world of Jewish study in ways where there was no going back. Now, did Jews understand this? Of course they did. So here you can see this is from introduction to the Soncino Talmud, 1483, as you can see. And here the so-called corrector of the volume involved in getting the right plates for the print says print books, right? So that they would provide two well-known benefits. That's why they're in this business. First, that a large number can be made until the world would be full of knowledge. And second, that the price will not be as high as the price of copies written with quills, iron pens, or lead. This captures it. It captures the fact that when you put this technology to your service, you've got this remarkable possibility, and they understood the implications of this from very early on. What's interesting, though, is that not everybody recognized the implications, or another way to say that is that you could recognize some of the implications without recognizing all of them. And that's what becomes crucial here. So just to focus, I'm going to use the Talmud here as an example. And I know that there was a prior speaker who referenced this, but it actually serves as a good example for the entire phenomenon. Though Venice was not the first center of print, quickly it became the largest international center of print. Already by the late 15th century, it was beginning to emerge in that way. And when we got to the 16th century, the 1500s, the Venice is where print is happening, and they are distributing their works. And by the way, this would continue into subsequent centuries as well. It should be said that Venice, the Venice Republic, it was the powerhouse politically and otherwise of the whole Mediterranean basin at this time. For any of you who have been to the wonderful exhibit we have at the Library of the Jews of Corfu, which unfortunately is closing soon. We've got this week and next week for it being open. But, you know, one of the things we emphasize there is that Corfu, as many other places in the Mediterranean, was under the domination of Venice. Culturally was influenced by Venice. Venice had its hands in everything at this time, and print was central to that. So during the 16th century, something like 15,000 distinct works were printed in Venice. That's an extraordinary number over those 10 years. Their print runs were often 1,000 or more, which is actually very significant. It's obviously not the bestsellers of our day, but anybody who's published, as I have, you know, books with an academic press, if you have a print run of 500, that's considered to be a good first printing for books for a specialized audience. So, you know, 1,000 or more is very significant. With respect to the Talmud, interestingly, the Talmud was printed 4 times in Venice before the mid-century. So the first one is the one you saw before. The second edition, also by Bomberg, as was the third edition. So the second edition was 1526 to 1539. Took them a little bit longer to sell out with that one. They had a third edition between 1543 and 1549. And then there was a competitive printer, Giustiani, who printed the entire Talmud between 1546 and 1551. So this is only an example of the enterprise, but it's a very, very good model for what's going on here. What does this lead to? In order to understand the next step, we've got to step outside the Jewish world for a moment and consider what print made possible. So before the Talmud was printed, going back to 1517, in a church in Germany, a broadside was posted on the door as part of a general distribution of a printed broadside that contained what came to be known as the 95 Theses. This, of course, was Martin Luther and the beginning of what we would know as the Protestant Revolution. During the age of manuscripts, not many people see written works. And when you've got official canonical works, they can be controlled by the authorities because there's so few of them. Knowledge is the realm of the central authorities. But when you gain the possibility of, first of all, reading what's available because there's so many more copies of it, and spreading the word because you can yourself print hundreds of copies, say, of a broadside, a single page thing that you put up on the door of a church, or of all kinds of works. And what emerges here during the 16th century is also the possibility of printing in the vernacular, because there were so many more people who could now begin to read because it was possible to print so much more. People wanted to read. They wanted access to text firsthand. And so no longer were Christians in general reliant upon the recitation and exposition of Latin scripture from church people. But they could actually gain access to these works themselves. And so the whole enterprise of translation began. You don't need to learn Latin in order to read the Bible, Jewish or Christian, Old or New Testament, according to the Christian way of describing things. You can read it in the language that you speak. And the church realized, against the background of the beginning of the Protestant Revolution, I know we would say Reformation, but it was a revolution, and it was a revolution that was made possible by the revolution of this new technology. Put this all together, and the church says, whoa, we've got a lot of trouble. And so, of course, the first reactions of the church to vernacular printing, in the translation and distribution of Bibles in the vernacular, was absolutely to forbid it. I mean, we would imagine the church would be all in favor of distributing copies of Bibles in the vernacular so people could read it. But of course, from the church's perspective, that's a serious problem, because now you could try to figure out what it meant for yourself. You could develop your own opinion of what the tradition said, and you wouldn't have to rely on and trust the conveyance of some expert within the church. And so, as a broad phenomenon that was not beginning with a notice of problems in Jewish writings, but began with Martin Luther and all of the phenomena that I just described very, very quickly, in the mid-16th century, the mid-1500s, in Venice and then elsewhere, the church, the Inquisition, began to say, we better intervene here. And this is where censorship emerges as an important piece of the story. So what I'd like to do here is, first of all, I'm sorry, I just want to get my whole page here again. This is a very interesting statement. You can see it's from the mid-16th century, from a fellow named Emek Habacha, reporting on Pope Julius's response to an ordered destruction, very famously ordered destruction of the Talmud in Rome in 1552, first in Rome and then in Venice and elsewhere. I'll go through the details of that in a moment, but you can see what he said, right? This is actually being reported on his behalf. In those days, converts to Christianity, and there were many, brought evil slander against the Talmud before Pope Julius, saying there is one Talmud scattered and dispersed among the nations. Notice the way this is actually a framing. The language is a direct echo of what Haman says to Achashverosh in the book of Esther, in the scroll of Esther, in his slander against the Jews, declaring that they should be wiped out. So I don't believe for a minute that anybody actually said this to Pope Julius, but the message in essence was certainly conveyed. So one Talmud scattered and dispersed among the nations, and its laws are different from all other nations. And they speak libel against your Messiah, and it is not fitting for the Pope to leave them in peace. And the impetuous Julius was greatly angered, and he said, take it out and burn it. So this is in 1552. Between 52 and 54, after the initial burnings in Rome and in Venice, all Hebrew printing houses in Venice were shut down. The last Hebrew book to be printed during this period, at least officially, was in Cremona in 1559, although there were certainly Hebrew presses that operated in secret. And then, and there's some back and forth on this, a lot of back and forth, I have to say. There was a new regime where censorship became official. So what I'd like to do now is go forward to the next several examples of this, and I've got some good photos of material from our collection. But I want to emphasize that what you're about to see is not a phenomenon of the church against the Jews. It is a phenomenon of the church against anything they deem to be dangerous. And beginning in the early 1550s, actually even slightly before that, 1549, the church compiled lists of forbidden works, works that were forbidden to be published. This came even before censorship as an alternative method to the same. The first one, as I said, was in Venice in 1549. There was another a decade later, 1559, that included the Talmud. But the vast majority of works on these lists were not Jewish works. Although they included Jewish works, the vast majority were Christian or other kinds of works that the church objected to. So let me give you, actually, I'll come back to that. This is what I think is probably the most famous example. And let me talk first of all about the way censorship worked. So censorship was both retrospective and prospective. It's only in retrospect that many works were recognized as being potentially dangerous or slanderous or the like. And when I say only in retrospect, what I mean is the church never noticed these things before because there were few copies, so it wasn't worth paying attention to it. But once these things began appearing in print, then two things happened. First, things that had been written or printed earlier were censored retrospectively. I'll say more about that in a moment. And then there are new things being printed, and they needed to pass the approval of the censor before they could be printed in the first place. And so literally the shape of those works was changed in a way that I'll show you. Here you can see from our wonderful manuscript, the Estlingen Machzor of 1290. You can see at the top written very large with necks of dragons rising above it. The dragons' heads have been cut off. Aleinu l'shabech, a prayer that many of you know. And you can read it and you'll recognize all the words. Aleinu l'shabech l'adon hakol, latet gdula liotzer breshit, shelo asanu k'goyei aratzot, v'lanu lo samanu k'mishpachot adama, shelo sam chelkenu kahem v'gor aleinu k'chol amonam. And then there's a full line, which has been scratched out. And then it continues, V'anachnu korim u'mishtachavim u'modim. Now, many of you will know about this, though I don't imagine all of you do. there used to be a line here that was included in all the manuscripts and included in early print, which said, Shehem mishtachavim lahevel varik umitpalalin el lo yoshia. For they bowed down to emptiness and nothingness, and worship, a God who will not save them. And that Lo Yoshia is a clear reference to Yeshua, meaning Jesus. And so this was understood by the church, and I think for good reason, because whether it originated this way or not, Jews who recited this, as Jews did before the censorship, certainly were taught to think of this as being connected to Jesus. Looking back at manuscripts or early print, the church says no, right? They're not going to curse us for bowing down to nothingness and hoping in a savior who will not save us. Interestingly, most of us grew up, and perhaps most of us to this day still recite this without the line that's been censored. If you have a Siddur that was printed in Israel, Israel doesn't abide by this censorship. So any book that was printed in Israel will include the censored line. Again, today, you're welcome to decide whether you're comfortable with that or not. But this is, as I say, the outstanding example. That was, retrospective censorship. This is also retrospective, but of a slightly different fashion. So this is, as you can see, the top text with the vowels is from the book of Psalms. This was printed in Naples in 1487. So it's a very early printed work in Hebrew. In early printed works from this first half century of printing are called incunables or incunabula. And it was printed with the commentary of the very famous 12th century biblical commentator, Jewish biblical commentary, Radak, David Kimchi. And in his commentary on Psalms, there were certain Psalms that were read in the church as prefiguring the life of Jesus. And so in the section you can see here, which the censor tried to erase from our eyes. The censor, by the way, his signature is right there. So even though this was printed in 1487, it didn't come to be censored till 1584. And, we have in the rear of the volume the printer's mark. But you can see on this page and on this page, the commentary of Radak, which argues against Christian interpretation of the Psalms. And I do have to tell you, it's interesting if you look carefully, that the printer's ink here, whoops, I went the wrong direction. Printer's ink is not as good as the censor's ink. So what was once upon a time a censored section, ironically now almost highlights it. And we can easily read what Radak had to say through the censor's ink here. And he pulled no punches. He was very, very explicit in dismissing Christian commentary as ignorant, as ridiculous, as unlearned. I mean, all kinds of things, because of course he didn't imagine that what he wrote would be read by any Christian either. Again, this was, what people knew back in the 12th century during the world of the manuscript. One of the most really extraordinary examples of censorship goes back to the Talmud. Here you can see we're in Tractate Sanhedrin, page 43a. And this is early on in the chapter of the Talmud Sanhedrin that talks about execution, right? I mean, the tractate is about the Jewish court, and one of the penalties in the court is execution. The question, therefore, is how does the execution take place? And what you see, this is the original printing, the Bomberg going down to the bottom of the page. This comes from our copy of that first printing. Look now at a later printing. This is my own copy of the Talmud, right? Let me go back and forth. These are the same page. Every other page of this, the central text would be identical. right? But here you can see that it goes down to the margin. And here there's a huge amount of wasted space. There's a remarkably, and I've circled that there, there's a remarkable amount of empty margin there. What happened? Right? If we go back here, we've got the story of the execution of Jesus and his disciples as told by the Talmud there. And the Talmud is perfectly explicit that it is the Jewish court that killed Jesus. It's not that the church wanted to censor. But what the Talmud story does here is to mock Jesus and particularly Jesus's disciples. It's very irreverent. And so needless to say, the church objected to that and insisted that when the Talmud would be printed again, that section would be left out. This is not the only example in the Talmud, but it is the most visually arresting of those. It's like you can't miss. And it's sort of shocking to see the two pages side by side. So there is more to say here, but these are some outstanding examples. And I want to just take a moment to ask if you have any questions here. Let me just see if there's anything I wanted to do before stopping for questions. No, this is a good place to do it. Let me just see. I've got a couple of quotes. I'll come to that in a moment. Okay, so let me go back so I can see a little bit of the screen. And Julia, why don't you let me know if there's any questions being asked?
Sure. Several people asked about the levels of literacy at this time, and kind of what was the process for teaching people to read? Were children taught to read? Were there beginner texts, or was it kind of an elite, rarefied thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Let me just first of all say here emphatically that when you read about this, claims for the level of Jewish literacy are often very romanticized. This notion of the centrality of learning to Jewish culture, and it is central to Jewish culture, but there is often a failure to recognize the difference between the world of manuscripts and the world once print comes around, when things changed radically, even within the Jewish community, as a matter of definition, because there was no alternative, there was no public schooling, communities might gather their funds to pay for teachers of children, which means, of course, young boys. But in the absence of wealth, that was generally a very preliminary education. Talmudic education, for example, or other kinds of advanced Jewish education only began during those years. Again, there's some cultural shifts here, but in the teen years, and by that point, for other financial reasons as well, but there aren't many texts around. There are very few people who have arrived at the level where it's worth investing in their education. It's hard, frankly, to practice reading because there are very few things around to read. Reading requires practice. It really does. And if you're out of practice, you're not going to be able to read well. So when we talk about literacy, we should actually talk about levels of literacy. Most people could probably sign their names on a contract. Some people could do some basic writing if they were involved in business and trade and so forth. To read literature was meaning religious literature, otherwise was a very high level of literacy. And to be able to write, right? In that world, reading and writing were two separate knowledges. We take it for granted that they go together. Right, but for them, they were separated. So you could be literate in reading and have no idea how to write. Right, that was a very real phenomenon. One of the things that was very influential in this is affluence, wealth. We know well, and there's a lot of evidence for this, that people who were wealthy, Jews who were wealthy, paid for the education of their children. They hired tutors, and this was true not only for boys, but for girls as well. And so I mentioned before this prayer book that we have in our collection, where a woman recites this blessing, thanking God for making her a woman and not a man. She came from a very wealthy family living in northern Italy in the 15th century, and she was taught to read. She read this Siddur that was given to her, but she was taught because it was considered amongst the wealthy to be a part of proper grooming for adulthood.
Thank you. There were a few questions kind of about how this censorship actually worked. Like, how did they come upon these Jewish texts? How did, if an individual censor is censoring an individual text, are they trying to get their hands on all of them? How did this play out?
Good. So excellent question. And I'm going to use it as a bridge. For the next part. I'll stop again. Yeah, there may be other questions now, but since it's so perfect for what I wanted to get to immediately, I'm going to use it as a bridge. Should I share my screen again, or whoever took it off, do they want to put it back on? I can use mine again.
Yes, please go ahead and share.
Yeah, go ahead. So let me see, which one was I on here? I got past that one. That was here. So I think I'm, basically here. Let me see, from current slide, that was Sanhedrin. Let me go to the next one. So actually, you know what, I'll go, okay, let me go back this way. So for the moment, I'll leave you on Sanhedrin in order to begin answering the question. So when the church went from destruction to censorship, and there's a history behind that I'll leave for a little bit later. We ended 2:30 our time, Julia, right? I just want to make sure I'm covering this right. Okay, just want to make sure I was had this correct. So I'll wait on this a little bit, but so when censorship began, again, it was first against Christian works and then against Jewish works. Several things were happening simultaneously. As I said, they would go back to earlier works and censor them. Any work that was now to be printed anew required prior approval. Things that had been printed earlier would be censored. How did they know, though, what belonged here? I made mention before of the indices, right? These were lists of works that the church either forbade, or there were other lists. I mean, there were outright prohibited works, but there were also passages that were forbidden or had to be censored. And so we've got in our collection announcements, broadside. This pertains to Jewish works, but there were similar such broadsides for Latin works, for Christian works. Anyone who possesses any of the following works must turn it in to the Inquisition authorities by such and such a date, or risk, very severe punishment. And the punishments were very, very severe. Now, turning it in didn't mean that they would be destroyed. Turning it in meant that they would be censored. And so there were folks working for the church. You saw one of their signatures on the book that I showed you on screen a little bit earlier. With respect to Hebrew books, both the list of objectionable passages and those who did the work of censorship were often Jews who had converted to Christianity. They would go back and they would identify the sections that needed to be, from works that were held that had been produced before censorship. They would go through, they would find the passages, and they would either scratch it out or cover it with ink or some such thing. If it was a new printing, the printer, in order to avoid confiscation, and this was a business, so you don't want to print something and have it be confiscated and held in a warehouse, which was what would have happened. You had to get prior approval in order for a work to be published. Some of you may have seen from old books, they might have reference to the imprimatur of the royal authorities wherever they were printed. That's what this is about. It means that, the king or the church gave approval to what was to be printed here. But the approval to what was to be printed in the case of Jewish works always involved scanning, same was true of Christian works, of course, scanning to see if there were any problematic passages. Now, don't get the misimpression, and this is very, very important, that this was something that only the church was interested in. This wasn't about the church versus, problematic Christian teachings and Jews. This was authorities who wanted to maintain their authority, right? So authorities, in order to maintain their authority, need to the degree possible, control information. So within the Jewish world, look at these examples, right? So this is from the Shulchan Aruch, and it's quite explicit, right? Books containing common riddles and proverbs, as well as words of desire, divrei cheshek, such as the Book of Emmanuel and books of war, one is forbidden to read them in Shabbat, and even during the week, it is forbidden on account of the prohibition of, quote unquote, biblical phrase, the company of scoffers, moshav leitzim. So this is Jewish censorship of Jewish works. It's in the context of things that you're permitted to touch and permitted to read on Shabbat. But as you can see, this goes beyond the Shabbat prohibition to categories of works, and even mentions one particular work, this Book of Emmanuel. That's what it's referred to in the Shulchan Aruch. It's broadly known as Machbarot Emmanuel. It was in manuscript. It was from about 1300. I'll describe it in a moment. It was amongst the earliest of Hebrew printed works before censorship. So it existed, in print before censorship. And the Shulchan Aruch, written in the mid-16th century. So this is the age where censorship is, exploding with reference to print around Europe. Yosef Karo, the writer of the Shulchan Aruch, condemns this work in particular. What is it? It is a book of poetry and philosophy. It is actually the source of the song that many of us know of as Yigdal. If you look at the notes in your prayer book on Yigdal, it says it's derived from the 13 principles of faith of Maimonides. It's actually derived from that only indirectly. In the Machbarot Emmanuel and the Book of Emmanuel, written by Emmanuel of Rome in about 1300, there is a section where he actually derives principles of theology or of faith from Maimonides and writes in poetic form these 13 principles, using often the exact language, which is then stolen for what we call Yigdal. Why would this book be forbidden? Because in modern works, and this was true going back even to the manuscript age, the age of Emmanuel, but this was also true, interestingly, during the 18th century in France. There's some very good book history scholarship on this, and we find it elsewhere. To explain this, the best way to do this is to say that the word philosophe, right, which all of us understand, but the French word philosophe in the 18th century meant pornographer. Yeah, I saw your face there, Julia. The reason the word philosophe meant pornographer is because these works would, at least in the 18th century, exclude a lot of very explicit narrative and illustrations, and the illustrations were actually rather explicit as well. But rather than smoking cigarettes, after the act, they would talk philosophy, right? So philosophe became a euphemism for pornographer, in effect. Well, if we go back to Emmanuel's book, the whole book is about a learned young man trying to seduce a young woman who he finds to be a knockout, and he wants to, seduce her through the beauty of his words and his great wisdom. And so he writes these long, beautiful poems. One of them is, as what Yigdal is derived from. But they are long, beautiful poems And then there is the non-poetic part of the work as well, but it's also theology. So it's theology and love poetry, but the love poetry, again, can become pretty explicit sexually. And that is why it is prohibited here, because it is the kind of stuff that low people would read. The Company of Scoffers, of course, the reason it was an early bestseller is because not only scoffers, but people in general enjoy reading these things. So that's one example. And there were other examples of that. How much did the rabbis, I'll come back to that in a moment. How much did the rabbis want to control this? So this is Northern Italy still, 1554, Ferrara, right? And this is a declaration of the delegates of the Italian Jewish congregations. Printers shall not be permitted to print any hitherto unpublished book except with the permission of 3 duly ordained rabbis. Right? Sharing ideas wasn't free. Freedom of speech, freedom of print wasn't free during this period. The church didn't like it and rabbinic authorities didn't like it, because if you can get your hands on a printing press, and if you can write, whatever it is you write and distribute those ideas, you can actually be pretty darn subversive. And that, of course, everyone knew about from Martin Luther, but it happened elsewhere as well. And so censorship was a large-scale phenomenon, and it was one that the new technology necessitated. The new technology represented a danger. And the authorities responded by freaking out. We can't allow this danger to persist, although, of course, in the end, the technology won and the authorities lost. That's part of the subsequent history. But during this period, the phenomenon general is what we see here. So I would like to actually step outside of this and interpret it all with you. I've given you the basic facts of this, but then there are interpretations which also need to be added, and I would like to add them. Before we do that, though, let's unshare the screen for a moment. I'll come back to show some of these again going forward, but I'd like to take some questions now.
All right, now I have tons of great questions piled up here.
Okay.
Okay. Could you mentioned the move from destruction to
Censorship.
the censorship and warehousing. What can you say more about why that move?
Yes. So the meaning of that move, it's actually interesting. And there's common confusion here. This is an idea which is very commonly confused. Before print, there was rare actual censorship. Censorship wasn't a thing before print. What there was destruction of books, but destruction of books is very different than censoring certain passages from books. So I want to read to you, this was part of what I was going to get to, but this is a very, very interesting interpretation of this phenomenon, which I think is worth sharing with you. I agree with this, and I would actually take it even further. But the work that I'm sharing now is called "The Censor, the Editor, and the Text." It is a history of this period. The subtitle is "The Catholic Church and the Shaping of the Jewish Canon in the 16th Century." By Amnon Raz-Krakotskin, was written originally in Hebrew. This is U of Penn Press. I mean, it's an academic press, but very, very interesting history. This Israeli scholar interprets this phenomenon in response to the question. So I want to give, first of all, credit for this insight where credit is due. So he writes as follows. This is on page 45. And he has a section here on the burning of the Talmud. So this is pre-print. The symbolic and ritual dimension of printing of the Talmud is the name of this section. He says, the book burnings were parallel in character and intention to the burning of human beings, which was also common practice towards those suspected of heresy, sorcery, or magic in the 16th and 17th centuries. It happened before too, but think of the murder of witches or the burning of witches or the like, even in this country. I mean, so this was a thing, but it was a thing that symbolically acted to punish, to purify, to eliminate the stain of heresy, sorcery, and magic. Now he goes on a little bit below on the page, makes reference to the fact that, referencing a very prominent scholar of punishment, during the Middle Ages, that this was all theatrical and public punishment. Right? There was something very theatrical about it. It was publicly demonstrative. So he goes on and says, the book burnings were not an act of punishment as such, although I might take issue with that, but they were similar to the execution of heretics and a ceremony of purification in which society is purified of the causes seeking to destroy it. Right? Again, let me read that. It's very important. Book burnings were not an act of punishment as such, but similar to the execution of heretics, a ceremony of purification in which society is purified of the causes seeking to destroy it. Applying that to the Talmud, I mean, you can censor the Talmud, and most Talmuds that were printed between the mid 16th century in Venice and frankly the 20th century in Israel. That's when things changed again, right? But during all of that time, all Talmuds were censored and few people bothered to notice it because it didn't affect the Talmud much at all. I'll come back to that in a moment. But when the Talmud was burned, when it was, taken out to the public square in Rome and burned, or burned in Paris back in 1290, for example, that wasn't about removing problematic passages. That was about symbolically destroying the enemy. That's another way I would describe it. And from the perspective of the church, the Talmud is extremely significant in that respect because, unlike the Hebrew Bible, which of course became part of the Christian canon, the Talmud represents where Jews went wrong, right? So up to and through the so-called Old Testament, right? No problem. Church doesn't object to that. But it's when along came Jesus, early Christian, but also the early rabbinic period, that Christians went in one direction, and in their stubborn disbelief, Jews following the rabbis went in another direction, and rabbinic Judaism came to be symbolized by the Talmud. The Talmud represents the enemy, and therefore, right, the Talmud must be destroyed because, again, it's not about individual teachings. It's about what the Talmud as a whole represented. Ironically, therefore, and I'll come to this in more detail in a little bit, when censorship takes over from burning, right? When Talmuds, for example, are censored far, far more, I mean, they're no longer burnt at that point. What's the consequence of this? And again, this is Raz Kratushin. This is the interpretation, and I'll build on it, but let me give you just a little bit of what he says, what he writes here. I mean, beautiful. He says, censorship was initiated precisely because Christians were reading Jewish literature, right? So in other words, not only Christian censorship of Christian things, but Christian censorship of Jewish things was initiated because all of a sudden Christians who had access to Jewish works could read them. So censorship was initiated because Christians were reading Jewish literature. Thus, it could be examined within the framework of the rise of early modern Christian Hebraism. Christians began to learn Hebrew, right, during this period because you had works with multiple translations side by side, and they could therefore see what Jews had said in the distant past. Now he goes on and said, as such, now listen, this is very counterintuitive. Censorship must be seen as a means of incorporating Jewish literature into Christian discourse and into the category of permitted knowledge, right? By censoring out the few problematic passages, it makes it, the church actually gives it its authorization. It says you can read these things, Christians and Jews, right? You can read them. They are authorized by us as permitted knowledge. He goes on a little bit further down on the page, this is on page 3, to say, right, the practice of censorship entailed a careful reading of various texts and resulted in the authorization of what the church considered to be permissible knowledge. So you might have a few lines from the bottom of Sanhedrin 43a that are eliminated from the Talmud. But when censorship becomes the way of approaching these things, unlike in the past when you would burn the whole thing, which is why only one manuscript, there's only one complete manuscript of the Talmud from the Middle Ages, only one that survives. Right. And the reason for this is because of the burnings in the past. If it had been censorship alone, then far more would have survived. Thank God one did survive. But again, what it tells us is what the church authorized. That's the irony of censorship. So I think that somehow went back to the question that was asked, but I don't remember the path that led me there now. So I'll send it back to you, Julia, for other questions. I mean, you're right, for other questions.
Okay, great. I don't know if you want to address this now or at the end, but the most common question that's been coming in the whole time is how much of the censorship that was done stuck, meaning, right, like the LA New text that you shared near the beginning, that most Sidurim that we use here don't have that anymore.
The vast majority of it stuck. The reason it stuck was because Jews lived, at least Jews who printed books, right? Print came to Muslim countries much later. There was great resistance in Muslim countries to the printing press because of they recognized the danger of what printing presses could do. And there was also a kind of traditionalism vis-a-vis the sacred text. You wanted to write the sacred text the way we do in a Torah scroll, and they would continue to want to do that for a Quran as opposed to printing it. The first printers in the Turkish realm, for example, were Jews. Who actually Sephardi Jews who brought some of their print from Spain, from the Iberian Peninsula when they were expelled. But most of the censorship stuck because there was no alternative to that. And it was only when we come to modern Israel, literally Israel, so after 1948, when Jews could say, we don't need to abide by their censorship, that some of these passages they went back and restored. So if you look at a prayer book that's printed in Israel today, it includes that line from Aleinu. If you look at a Talmud printed in Israel today, it includes the sections that insult Jesus and so forth.
Thank you. There was a question about how much, and I wonder how much we can know the answer to this question, but was there a lot of self-censorship being done preemptively to kind of avoid scrutiny or out of fear of what reaction it might bring on?
Wow, this is perfect. Another setup for me for the last thing I wanted to. I mean, it's just amazing how the answer is absolutely yes. The rabbis cooperated in this fully, not only for their own sake, what we saw a few moments ago, but because they understood they wanted this knowledge to be disseminated, and they therefore, wanted printers who were printing Jewish works to be able to print them and sell them. And the way to do this was to cooperate with the authorities. So let me go back and share my screen once again here. I don't know, is that it? Yeah, I'm still there. It's open. Okay, so this, by the way, I don't want to skip over it. This is from back to that Esslingen Machzor, so it's High Holiday prayer, and it's the prayer from the High Holiday Machzor that many of you, Hayom Ta'amtzenu, Hayam Tavarchenu, and so on. And as you can see, there's in the middle of this a large Hayom followed by some smaller words that were scratched out.
Dr. Kraemer?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. You're not currently sharing.
Oh, okay. You know what?
Just...
Okay. I thought they were both. So let me go back and share this once again. I'm sorry. So let me get this. I thought that one was sharing. So let me get it back again. I've got it there. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. And from current slide, did that work? From current slide, there we are. Right there. Okay. So you can see there's some scratching out there in Hayom. This is Jews censoring Jews. It's actually, it says, if you read behind it, today may those who don't do tshuva be wiped out. Right? Not very nice sentiment for Yom Kippur, I might say, but it's clear that it's subsequent Jewish communities who took issue with this. So that's internal Jewish censorship. Coming back here for a moment, let me see, I think I've got it right here. This was, as you can see, printed still in Northern Italy, Mantova, 1596, a Jew who had converted to Christianity, who ironically does Hebrew printers a great favor. And this is a book called Sefer HaZikuk, which means the book of purification. And what it means to do is purify books so that they can be printed. So I included only a few examples. There are 20 items on this list. So the word avodah zarah, right, foreign worship, can't be mentioned, right? Unless it explicitly refers to idolatrous practices of the past, because it might be confused to refer to Christians. And of course, the church wouldn't permit that. And so in all printings of the Talmud on those occasions, the word avodah zarah was replaced with the abbreviation akum, which means ovdei kochavim umazalot. But today in Hebrew, I mean, in religious community in Hebrew, akum just means them, idolaters. Or the word goy, right? Goyim, nochri, right? Which could so easily just simply refer to your Christian neighbors, and therefore the statement would be problematic. Replace that one with akum. Or any place that explicitly mentions Edom, Rome, or Italy in an insulting way, right? Now, that's a little bit funnier a category because Italy was a relatively neutral term. We've got mention in the Mishnah, for example, of the fine quality of Italian wines. They knew about that all the way back in the early Rabbinic age. But Rome and Edom both stand in for Christendom, because remember, the Eastern Empire became the Byzantine Empire. So the ongoing empire that called itself Rome was also at the same time the Christian Empire. And there are plenty of insulting references to either Rome or Edom in rabbinic literature. So those needed to be eliminated. And then you've got others. Interestingly, and this is extremely significant, the word Talmud was a problematic word because of the symbolism I mentioned before. So beginning with the Council of Trent in 1559, but then subsequently, you could no longer use the word Talmud in the Talmud. Now, the interesting piece of that is that by eliminating the word Talmud in the Talmud, you left most of the Talmud. So what were the consequences? In general, the word Talmud was replaced with the word Gemara, right? So the name we know of for the work, the Talmud, we call it the Gemara, that actually is a product of the censor's intervention. Up to that point, the Gemara wasn't called the Gemara, but when it was replaced in censorship, that became the common Jewish way of referring to it as well. So, I mean, that's a longer question on, did we cooperate? And the answer is absolutely, because as Raz Kratoshin mentions before, the ironic consequence of this was that it actually authorized Jewish publication, because it told us not only what the church would not tolerate, but what the church would authorize.
Do you want to take a follow-up question?
Yeah, let's take it for sure. I mean, now I'm essentially finished with my presentation. I want to have a few final words, but I imagine there's a bunch of questions now, one of which I'm anticipating, but let's see if it comes through, right? I won't suggest it myself, but go ahead. Okay.
So, oh my gosh, I just lost my train. Give me a second. The follow-up question is, we do still have a lot of negative characterizations of non-Jews, Christians, Edom, Rome in our text. So how did so many of them survive?
I don't know what did the questioner provide an example? Because most of them were eliminated.
The person mentioned Rashi specifically.
Yeah, but anything that's explicit, like the Radak, right, was censored. right? We've got to regain them. Actually, I don't know. That's interesting. I don't know what they're referring to in Rashi. One of the ironies of our printed Rashi was that there we've got an example of a massive example of Jews censoring Jews. And this happened early on. It actually wasn't Rashi, but Rashi's, what is it, his grandson, Rashbam, if I've got that right. Rashbam's commentary, the first many chapters of it were censored after their initial printing, because Rashbam, in his commentary on the first chapter of Genesis, suggests very explicitly that the biblical day begins in the morning and not at night. Right. And of course, Jews think of the Jewish day beginning at night and think of the Talmud citing the first chapter of Genesis as one of the proofs of that. But the rabbis had great skills at intentionally misreading biblical texts. They knew what the simple meanings were, but they also knew how to misread them for their own purposes. But Rashbam actually gave the simple meaning of the biblical text, that the day begins in the morning, but this freaked the rabbis out so much that they actually censored it. And I think it's true in typical Mikrot Gedolot, it hasn't been restored to this day. You can find printings of Rashbam's commentary that included, but generally it's not.
Thank you. Okay, so we asked before how much of the censorship stuck, meaning how many of those texts sort of stayed out of the canon. So there's a follow-up question to that, which is kind of beyond the specific censored passages. How much do you think that censorship might have impacted ideology, theology, sort of, self-understanding, like really the content of what was carried forward?
That's a really good question. I mean, I've had experience thinking about that with respect to Aleinu, because I can't figure out which version of it I prefer, either the censored or the uncensored version. And I confess that both of them give me some pause. According to the original version, what it says there is, we Aleinu l'shabech l'adon hakol, we praise the, and then it goes on that it says, because they pray to, emptiness and nothingness and, to a God who can't save them, v'anachnu, and we pray to a God who can save, right? So in that version, in the non-censored version, it's pure theology. It might be problematic theology in that it negates their God and that God's salvation powers, but it's only about God. In the censored version, frankly, it comes across as somewhat racist, right? Because what it says is, this God didn't make us like any of the other nations, and didn't make our lot like any of the other, nations of the world. Now, in the original, the explanation of that is because they don't pray to the true God and we do, right? But if you eliminate that line, it just says, right, because he didn't make us anything like them, thank God, right? And that's a really problematic statement, right? So I don't know which of those. It certainly affects the way we understand the prayer. But if you know the original, in my experience, you've got to struggle with both of them. I think that's probably the most present example and therefore the most influential because it's recited literally at each and every service. The emendation, I mean, if you go back to the manuscript from the Geniza that I showed at the beginning, which calls for the, God to wipe out Christians, right? I think the elimination of that from the prayer, probably, first of all, A, was a good thing, and B, opened up different fields of possibility for those who were praying it. That's, as I say, you heard my immediate response. It's a great question and it deserves more consideration.
Great. I see we're running low on time, so I'm just going to combine two questions into one and then you can take it away for the rest.
Sure.
So a couple of people have asked if there were how strong were the teeth on these these prohibitions, and were there printers who were flouting the rules and going ahead and printing censored material? And the related question I'll throw in was, someone asked him who was financing all this printing, and how do we have any idea how they might have responded to this kind of censorship? Did they stop funding the printing?
No, it's a good question. All of those are really good questions. Let me go back to the beginning of the question. So some printers tried to print some of the problematic material, but they ran the risk of being put out of business, right? I mean, that was the immediate consequence for the printers. Your print shop was shut down, and you had a really serious investment in this technology. So you don't want to be put out of business. The way to avoid that is to cooperate. And again, since the actual consequences of censorship were relatively minor. We saw examples here, right? They're relatively minor. You have to know where to look to find the censorship. The works remain largely the way they were. And of course, so the printers had their own interest in this. The people who were the investors, and there were investors, had interest in the printers being able to make money. Right. So, it may be the people who opened the shop who were invested in their own business, others invested, but they were all interested in making money. And so you go along with this regime. It has minimal impact if you're willing to cooperate. If individuals refuse well, actually, let me step back. There were, as I mentioned earlier, printers who printed in secret. Right. And there were periods during the 16th century when any printing of the Talmud was forbidden, before you have this regularization with censorship. And during that period, the shops relocated, they went into hiding, and they would print in secret. Individuals who were found with works that had to be presented for censorship, if they didn't do that, and they were discovered, they ran the risk of very severe punishment. Death wasn't impossible, honestly. Severe physical punishment was very possible. And so, my view is you probably had to be crazy, not to cooperate, because the consequences were so great. One of the things that I hope this shows you, there's much more to be learned from this. Actually, two things. Number one, revolutions in information technology change the world, right? And we're not the first to appreciate that. There are actually many parallels between that age and our own. And so it's worth thinking of that whenever you think about, how have all the new information technologies, the electronic technologies affected us, influenced. Think of the parallel back then, and you'll actually be in a wiser position to evaluate, because there is literally nothing new under the sun when it comes to phenomena in general. And the other thing I would say is, never run the risk of interpreting anything as a Jewish phenomenon uniquely. Right? Jews are human beings, and we experience everything in the context of the larger human societies in which we live. You would not understand censorship and the church and its relationship to Jews if you just focused on that. As I hope today's session has showed, it's part of a much larger phenomenon, and it was complex and with some unexpected meanings and outcomes.
Thank you. I'll just, with your permission, I'll add another takeaway that I loved your takeaways. And another thing that I'm
all yours. Go ahead.
Is, you pointed out that that the censorship it's kind of small scale, and a few people mentioned how some Aleinu, for example, right, like Sidurim of progressive denominations, or like we're already changing. Some of the things that were changed then, we're now changing of our own accord, because we don't necessarily like those sentiments. But it makes me think that, we get very focused on small things in the liturgy as kind of big divisions between us. One example is the inclusion of the imahot, the matriarchs, in the Amidah. And it's sort of this big statement on, do you believe in liturgical change or not? And are you, how conservative are you? And it's actually, it goes back to the beginning, that the changes were small and significant. And they were seen that way outside the Jewish community and within.
And if you lived during the manuscript age and wanted to say something different, nobody cared, right? And they wouldn't argue about it because they wouldn't know about it.
Right. All right, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for this session today, and the takeaways you just shared. And there were so many wonderful questions we didn't get to, so I want to apologize to people for that. I want to thank our sponsors once again, Bonnie and Isaac Pollack, for making this session possible. And I want to make sure you'll all join us next week when we will be looking at probably the most, or definitely the most famous case of intra-Jewish censorship, which is Spinoza. So we hope to see you next week, and our censorship exploration will continue. Thank you so much again, Professor Kraemer.
My pleasure.